Welcome to The Debate. So picture this scenario, because it's really becoming the defining dilemma for the modern higher earner. You're standing in this amazing chef's kitchen of a property you've just toured. It's pristine. It has that dedicated home office you need for deep work. The school district is top tier, and you're holding an offer letter ready to sign. The rate's locked. The down payment is sitting there. But at that exact moment, your phone buzzes. It's a recruiter. There's a VP level role opening up in New York. Or maybe it's a Series A startup in Austin offering, huge equity. The package is life-changing. And in that split second, the pen is just hovering over the deed. The question we are debating today is not that tired old rent versus buy calculator. It's a fundamental question of high-stakes career strategy. Does signing that deed solidify a foundation for wealth, or does it effectively close the door on the single biggest driver of a high earner's success, their mobility?
And it's the single most expensive decision you can make. And I'm not talking about the closing costs. I'm arguing today that for the modern high-income professional, signing that deed is, it's effectively shorting your own mobility. You are placing a massive leveraged bet that your current local labor market is going to outperform the global market for your specific skills. I believe renting is not throwing money away, like the old saying goes. Renting is purchasing a call option on your career.
And I'm here to argue that this obsession with hypermobility is frankly overrated and financially inefficient. I argue that the home is a stability engine. It converts volatile, high-tax income into a long-duration, tax-advantaged asset. It acts as a hedge against inflation, literally letting you short the dollar, and provides the psychological base camp you need to sustain high performance over decades.
A base camp or a bunker? I think that's the distinction we need to make.
Well, let's find out. I want to lay out this stability engine idea first because it's often misunderstood as being, purely sentimental. We're talking about high earners here. For this demographic, income is high, but it's also volatile. You've got bonuses, RSUs, market swings. Buying a home is a mechanism to capture that volatility and lock it into a tangible asset. We always hear about the American dream, but let's just strip away the romance and look at the actual mechanics. When you buy a home with a 30-year fixed mortgage, you are essentially
You're shorting the dollar.
everything. Rent, food, gas, services. If you're renting, your housing cost just floats up with inflation every single year. But with a fixed mortgage, your largest monthly bill is frozen in time. As inflation devalues the currency, you're paying the bank back with cheaper dollars in year 10, year 15, year 20. Your debt is literally inflating away in real terms, while the asset, the house, is usually appreciating with inflation. It's a hedge that cuts both ways for you. And what's more, the home functions as a forced savings mechanism. We all like to think we're these disciplined investors, but the data is brutal. Lifestyle creep just eats up excess cash. A mortgage principal payment is automated wealth building that you can't skip. It protects you from your own worst spending habits. But beyond the math, it is this base camp concept. High performance requires operational stability. Owning your environment reduces decision fatigue. It lets you put down deep community roots, and it creates this sovereign foundation that actually improves your focus at work.
It paints a very cozy picture, I'll give you that. But you're ignoring the opportunity cost of that sovereignty. I view a high-income career as a series of asymmetric bets. The flexibility premium is the ability to seize on those bets, to capture, say, geographic pay differences, or to pivot industries without all the friction. When you buy a home, you introduce this massive friction tax. We're talking about transaction costs of 6 to 10% just to sell a home. If a career-defining opportunity means you have to move in under 5 years, that friction just wipes out your equity gains.
But how often do people really move for these so-called defining opportunities?
More often than homeowners would like to admit, or maybe more often than they can admit once they're locked in. I want to reference this fascinating analysis from the Bogleheads community that's been making the rounds. A prospective buyer ran the numbers. Everything: maintenance, property taxes, a vacancy buffer, and that friction tax. And they realized that the S&P 500 often outperforms real estate over 30 years without any of the liquidity constraints. Ownership creates what's called an anchoring effect. It creates this subtle, almost invisible pressure to rationalize staying in a job that's suboptimal because the cost of leaving the home, both financially and psychologically, is just too high. You end up monetizing your house, but stagnating your human capital. You're prioritizing the asset over the income stream, which for a high earner is completely backward.
I see the logic, I do. And the liquidity argument is the standard Boglehead defense. But let's get into the weeds of that anchoring effect. You claim ownership hurts your career because you're trapped. I want to challenge that, this assumption that homeowners are trapped and therefore miserable in their jobs. It doesn't always hold up.
Actually, there's empirical evidence that suggests exactly that. I'm looking at a study here by Tumman and Zaidanli. They used the British Household Panel Survey. They investigated the link between job satisfaction and home ownership, specifically tracking people who went from renting to owning. The findings were stark. Transitioning to ownership reduced job satisfaction within a year of the purchase.
Within a single year. That just sounds like buyer's remorse, not career stagnation.
Twice as sharp compared to people who owned outright. The reasoning they propose is that debt-financed ownership just amplifies concerns about reduced mobility. You become dependent on the local labor market. If your boss becomes a nightmare or the local industry takes a hit, you feel the weight of that mortgage preventing you from just walking away. You're not just settled, you're leveraged and stuck. You've lost the ability to say, I quit, without a huge backup plan. And that loss of agency, well, it bleeds into your job satisfaction.
That's a compelling study, but I would frame the causality completely differently. There is a counter theory. It's known as the better match theory, highlighted by researchers like Coulson, DeLima, and Jenkins. They argue that homeowners aren't trapped, they are settled, because they have already solved the career variable. The data suggests people generally choose to buy homes after they have found a job match where their salary meets or even exceeds the market average.
So you're saying the house is a trophy for winning the career game, not the end of it?
Exactly. In this view, homeownership is a signal of career stability, not the cause of stagnation. They don't move because they don't want to, not because they can't. The homeowner has achieved a level of seniority and pay where the marginal benefit of moving is just lower than the utility of staying put. You reach a point where uprooting your family for a 15% raise just isn't worth the chaos. That's not stagnation, that is optimization.
I'm not convinced, because that reasoning assumes the better match is permanent. I mean, in today's economy, skills depreciate faster than real estate appreciates. A better match in 2024 might be a redundant role in 2027 because of AI or offshoring. If you anchor yourself to a place based on a job match today, you're betting the entire industry won't shift from under you. And the Tumman study actually showed that the drop in job satisfaction persists and doubles within 3 years. That looks less like happily settled and more like handcuffed.
But are we conflating job dissatisfaction with life dissatisfaction? The home offers a hedge against the volatility of the rental market, which is a massive stressor. But let's look at the financials you brought up. You mentioned that Boglehead's analysis, the idea that you should just rent and invest the difference in the S&P 500. That works beautifully in a spreadsheet, but it ignores the single biggest structural advantage of real estate: leverage.
Leverage cuts both ways.
It does. It absolutely does. But in a stable, upward trend, it is a wealth multiplier that stocks just can't match for the average investor. Let's do the math. If you put $200,000 down on a $1 million home, you have 5-to-1 leverage. You control a $1 million asset with $200,000. If that home appreciates just 5%, which is historically pretty reasonable, that's a $50,000 gain.
Right, but that's on paper.
No, that's a 25% return on your cash invested. To get that same $50,000 gain in the S&P 500 with your $200,000, you'd need the market to jump 25% in 1 year. That's rare. In real estate, a boring 5% year gives you a 25% cash-on-cash return. And we haven't even touched on the tax advantages. The Section 121 exclusion lets a married couple walk away with $500,000 of capital gains completely tax-free after 2 years. That's a hidden yield. There is no vehicle in the stock market that gives you $500,000 in tax-free profit without strict limits like a Roth IRA. A home doesn't have those limits.
That's a fair point on the tax code. It is explicitly designed to favor ownership. However, you are glossing over the opportunity cost of capital. That $200,000 down payment is illiquid. It is trapped. If you had that money in VOO, an S&P 500 ETF, it's liquid in 2 days. You can access it for a business idea, a sabbatical, an emergency. In the house, it's dead equity unless you refinance, which costs money, or sell, which costs even more money.
But is liquidity always a virtue?
When you're building a career, yes. And about that Reddit analysis, the user iPhone 8 versus iPhone X spent months running these numbers. And what they found was that once you factor in the phantom costs, property management, the 1% to 2% annual maintenance, which is sensitive to inflation, higher insurance, HOA fees, that leverage advantage erodes a lot. Real estate is often pitched as passive, but it's operationally active. You are buying yourself a part-time job as a facility manager. When the boiler breaks, you don't call the landlord, you are the landlord. And that distracts from your main revenue engine, your career.
It is active, yes, but that activity grants you control. When you rent, you're subject to the landlord's decisions. If they sell, you move. If they jack up the rent, you pay. The stability engine creates a predictable fixed cost. You mentioned the friction tax of selling, but what about the friction of forced moves? Moving every 2 years because a landlord decides to cash out is a massive disruption to your focus and your family's rhythm.
I agree that forced moves are a risk. But let's look at the other side of that risk. Let's reset the tension here. We're debating which is financially better, leverage versus liquidity, but maybe that's the wrong question.
Okay, how so?
We should be asking, what kind of career risk profile are you underwriting? When you buy, you are underwriting the persistence of your local labor market. When you rent, you're underwriting the volatility of the global asset market.
That's an interesting way to reframe it. So you're saying the homeowner is long local jobs and the renter is long global mobility.
Exactly. And this brings me to a critical point about macro externalities. There's a famous paper by Blanchflower and Oswald called "Does High Home Ownership Impair the Labor Market?" They looked at U.S. states and found that high home ownership rates are a precursor to sharp rises in unemployment.
That sounds very counterintuitive. Usually we associate ownership with economic health, with community stability.
It is counterintuitive, which is why it's so important. The mechanism they propose is that high ownership reduces labor mobility, which increases commute times, and, crucially, it suppresses new business formation. This is the NIMBY effect. Not in my backyard. Homeowners get defensive of their property values and they block new developments or commercial projects. The result is a less dynamic local economy. So if you're a high earner buying into a hot market with high ownership, you might actually be buying into a region that is about to stagnate because that ownership density is stifling the very dynamism that attracted you in the first place. You're buying stock in a company that's stopped innovating.
I see why you'd lean on that study, but I would argue it applies more to, say, single industry towns or regions in decline, not the super hubs where most high earners are. Buying a home in a diversified city like New York or London or the Bay Area mitigates this risk because the labor market is so deep. You don't need to move cities to change jobs in New York. You just take the subway to a different stop. In fact, I would argue the base camp allows for deeper local networking. When you own, you're more invested in the community. You join the board, you know the neighbors, you build social capital. And that social capital often leads to better local opportunities than the mercenary renter who always has one foot out the door.
That assumes the super hubs stay super. Look at the shifts after 2020. We saw a massive migration of wealth and talent. If you bought that base camp in downtown San Francisco in 2019, your social capital didn't save you from a massive correction in both quality of life and asset value. The renter could leave for Austin or Miami in 30 days. The owner was house locked.
House lock is a real phenomenon, I grant you that. But let's talk about the behavioral side of that. You see the inability to move easily as a negative. I see it as a behavioral guardrail.
A guardrail against what? Taking a better job?
A guardrail against impulsivity and lifestyle volatility. There's this concept in behavioral economics, the WTA-WTP disparity, or willingness to accept versus willingness to pay.
Right, the endowment effect.
Exactly. You, the dissenter, you see the endowment effect as a bias where owners overvalue their homes and refuse to sell at a market price, and so they miss out on job offers. I see it as operational stability. The friction prevents you from uprooting your family for a 10% raise that might not pan out. It forces a longer time horizon. And let's go back to forced savings. The high earner who rents theoretically invests the difference in the S&P 500, but practically, behavioral studies show that money often just leaks into lifestyle creep. Nicer cars, more expensive vacations. The mortgage bill is a rigid liability that forces wealth accumulation. You can't lifestyle creep your way out of a mortgage payment.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that for this specific demographic. We're talking about high-income professionals, lawyers, doctors, tech execs. These are people who generally have financial literacy. The idea that they need a bank to force them to save feels patronizing. And about the endowment effect, it's not just about refusing to sell, it's about loss aversion. If the market dips even slightly, a homeowner with a high loan-to-value ratio might technically be underwater or close to it after transaction costs. They become paralyzed. A study by Gopalan and his colleagues found that people with underwater mortgages earned significantly less, about 5% less monthly than their counterparts. Why? Because they couldn't move to better opportunities. They were stuck optimizing for the house, not their career. That is the tail risk of the stability engine. It becomes a cage.
That is the risk of over-leverage, not ownership itself. If you buy within your means, you can weather the dip. But I want to pivot back to the psychological benefit. We live in an era of extreme cognitive load. The renter faces a lease renewal every 12 months. That's a recurring decision point. Do I stay? Do I go? Is the rent going up 10%? That's decision fatigue. The base camp eliminates that variable. It provides a distinct identity narrative outside of your job. When work is volatile, the home is constant. For a high earner-facing burnout, that sanctuary is an asset that pays dividends in mental health and sustained career longevity. You can't quantify the ROI of a sanctuary on a spreadsheet, but any executive who's burned out will tell you it is very real.
That's a compelling point, but have you considered that the sanctuary can be rented? The luxury rental market exists for this exact reason. You can rent the sanctuary without taking on the liability. And I would argue that true peace of mind comes from liquidity. Knowing I can survive a 2-year layoff because my capital is in liquid index funds rather than trapped in drywall, that, to me, is the definition of a sanctuary.
But that liquidity comes with the threat of displacement.
And your stability comes with the threat of anchor drag.
It seems we have arrived at the fundamental philosophical divergence here.
I think so. It's probably time to wrap this up.
So, to summarize my perspective, the home is a base camp. It prioritizes control. In a world of chaotic career and market dynamics, it creates a predictable environment. It reduces lifestyle volatility, and it locks in your housing costs against inflation. The cost is liquidity, yes, but the gain is a sovereign foundation. You're building a fortress that you control, which lets you weather the storms of the labor market from a position of strength.
And my summary is this. Renting is a call option. It prioritizes leverage, not financial leverage, but leverage of your human capital. It keeps your balance sheet liquid and keeps you professionally mobile. It lets you avoid the friction tax of transaction costs and the identity lock-in of the endowment effect. The cost is the lack of a permanent physical anchor, sure, but the gain is the ability to seize asymmetric career upside immediately, anywhere in the world. You remain a mercenary, agile, and ready.
So we leave our listeners with this unresolved tension. If you buy the home, you gain a fortress against inflation, but you anchor yourself to a single labor market. If you rent, you maintain the agility of a mercenary, but you remain exposed to the volatility of the asset market.
The final question to ask yourself is this. What is the one specific life outcome, a specific job, a family milestone, or a financial number that would justify exercising the base camp option and permanently giving up the call option? Until you can answer that, maybe keep your bags packed.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. If you enjoyed this discussion on wealth and mobility, please like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into finance. We'll see you next time.